Okay, so have you ever felt like one single day just totally changes the game? Like the whole world kind of tilts on its
Oh,
axis.
yeah. Definitely, I think April 2nd, 2025 had that feel to it.
Eh,
Big time.
I'm with you there, because that was the day President Trump drops this bombshell announcement about reciprocal tariffs, and not just like a little tweak. We're talking massive impact on trade with almost every country.
Yeah, massive is the right word for it.
Yeah.
This has the potential to rewrite the rulebook on global trade. And the speed of this whole thing, the announcement, and now the rollout, it's definitely got everyone's attention.
For sure.
Yeah.
So that's why we're doing this deep dive today, to really break down these reciprocal tariffs. What are they? How do they even calculate these things? Who's going to feel the biggest impact? And I mean, not just other countries, but us too, potentially. Like, what are the ripple effects here? And we've got to look at the initial reactions from around the world, because it's been a wild ride.
Absolutely. And to do that properly, we've gone deep into some key sources. We've got Breitbart News, NBC News, Al Jazeera Newsweek, each one bringing a slightly different angle to the table. And of course, we had to go straight to the source, the official documents from the United States Trade Representative, the USTR, to really understand the mechanics of how this is all supposed to work.
Right. It's about cutting through the noise, getting past the headlines, and giving you a clear picture of what this policy actually means. Because this is the kind of change that could have some serious long-term consequences. So think of this deep dive as your cheat sheet to being ahead of the curve on this one.
Okay, so let's rewind back to that day, April 2nd, when President Trump unveiled this whole plan, a day that some are already calling Liberation Day.
Yeah, it was quite the scene in the Rose Garden that day. President Trump held up this chart showing all the existing tariffs other countries have on American goods. And then he contrasted it with these new reciprocal tariffs the U.S. is going to impose. It's a very deliberate, very visual way to make his point. And the message was loud and clear, too. Vice President JD Vance did an exclusive interview with Breitbart News that same day, and he actually called it Liberation Day, saying this is how the U.S. finally stops being the world's piggy bank after 40 years. So what's behind that kind of thinking?
Well, there's this deep-seated belief among some that the U.S. has been getting the short end of the stick in global trade for decades, that other countries have all these barriers up, while the U.S. has been comparatively open. So Vance's comment really taps into that sentiment, and it paints these tariffs as a way to even the score.
Yeah.
To kind of rebalance the playing field.
Right. And it wasn't just about some vague idea of fairness. Either both NBC News and Breitbart highlighted a really specific and I think symbolic part of this announcement. The 25% tariff on all foreign-made cars. I mean, that's huge. It's not just a tweak to the system. It's a major shakeup, especially for the global auto industry.
Oh, absolutely. The auto industry is a global web these days. So a 25% tariff, that's not just a minor adjustment. It's a significant cost. It's going to ripple through manufacturers' supply chains.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it's going to affect the price consumers pay. This single decision could reshape the entire car market.
Okay, so we've got the what and the why, at least as it's being presented. But the real nitty-gritty is the how. How did they actually come up with these numbers? How did the USTR actually calculate these tariff levels? That's where those official documents get really interesting.
Yeah, this is where we get into the nuts and bolts. And the USTR formula is actually pretty specific. It's based on each country's goods trade surplus with the United States. Basically, how much more they're selling to us than we're selling to them. So to get the number, they take the value of a country's goods trade surplus with the U.S., they divide that by their total exports of goods to the U.S., and then they multiply that by 0.5.
So Breitbart News had this really clear example using China's 2024 numbers. They had a $295 billion goods trade surplus with the U.S., and they exported $438 billion in goods to us. So if you do the math, that gives you a surplus to export ratio of about 67.4%. Then you apply that 50% factor, and you end up with a 34% reciprocal tariff for China. So the bigger the surplus relative to what they're selling to us, the higher the tariff, right?
Right, that's the basic idea.
Yeah.
But there's also a baseline. The USTR laid out that any country with a smaller imbalance, or even if the U.S. has a goods trade surplus with them, they'll still get hit with a flat 10% tariff.
Yeah.
So it's not entirely proportional to the size of the surplus.
Interesting. And the USTR is saying they're doing this because it's a practical proxy for all sorts of foreign trade barriers they believe are out there. Things like regulations, subsidies, non-tariff measures, stuff that's hard to measure directly and retaliate against. So the idea is to use the trade surplus itself as a stand-in for all that. But is that really a sound way to do things?
Well, the USTR is presenting this as a practical approach. But you have to remember, economists don't all agree on whether a trade surplus automatically equals unfair trade practices. I mean, a surplus can happen for lots of reasons. Macroeconomic factors like a country's savings and investment rates, not just trade barriers. So using the surplus as a direct proxy, that's definitely a point of contention.
Okay, so with this calculation method in play, who's actually getting hit with these tariffs? And were there any surprises in terms of who made the list and who didn't? Newsweek had a pretty good breakdown of this.
Yeah, Newsweek's reporting showed that pretty much every country that trades with the U.S. is going to be affected in some way. And while a lot of them will be at that base 10% level, some countries with larger trade imbalances are facing way higher rates, like Cambodia is looking at 49%, and Lesotho is getting hit with a whopping 50%.
Lesotho's case is really interesting, and Al Jazeera did some digging into this. Apparently, the White House is claiming that Lesotho charges the equivalent of a 99% tariff on U.S. imports, which is how they got to that 50% reciprocal tariff. But an economic analyst in Lesotho was quoted as saying this could be absolutely devastating for their textile and apparel industry, which is a huge part of their economy. So this really highlights the potential for unintended consequences, right?
Without a doubt. It shows how these broad tariffs could really disproportionately impact smaller economies that are heavily reliant on specific industries and their trade with the U.S. It raises serious questions about potential economic instability in those places.
On the flip side, Newsweek also pointed out some notable exceptions, like Canada and Mexico aren't included, which makes sense considering the existing trade agreements and tariffs we already have with them. And then you've got countries that are under major U.S. sanctions, like Russia, Belarus, Cuba, North Korea. They're also excluded.
But here's where it gets kind of strange. Newsweek also pointed out that some countries are actually included, even though we have sanctions against them. Like Iran is going to face this new 10% reciprocal tariff, and Syria is looking at a 40% rate, even with all the other economic restrictions we have in place. So that suggests a very deliberate and maybe even targeted approach to how these reciprocal tariffs are being used in conjunction with our broader foreign policy tools.
Okay, so we've got this massive policy shift. The math is out there, and we know who's in the crosshairs. But what's been the reaction so far? I think it's safe to say it hasn't exactly been met with universal applause.
Yeah, that's an understatement. Let's start with the folks who are on board with this. As we mentioned, Vice President Vance is all in on this, arguing that it'll be a huge boon for American workers and that it'll boost our self-reliance. President Trump has been echoing that sentiment too, saying that companies are already planning to move back to the U.S. because of this.
And we did see some Republican senators acknowledging that there might be some short-term pain involved, possibly in the form of higher prices for us consumers. Senators Mullen, Lummis, and Kennedy all kind of voiced this to NBC News. But they also said they trust the president's overall strategy and that they believe the long-term payoff will be worth it. Senator Kennedy even hinted that they might be open to revisiting this if the hit to consumers is too hard.
But the critics have been really vocal, and they come from a lot of different corners. Economists, especially those connected to the Cato Institute, haven't minced words. They're drawing comparisons to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act from back in the 1930s, which was a period of major economic downturn. And they're warning about potential price hikes for consumers and even a possible full-blown depression. They even called the way the tariffs are calculated lazy and bizarre. What exactly were they taking issue with when it came to the methodology?
So Scott Lincecum and Colin Grabow over at Cato, they were quoted in Newsweek really going after the logic of all this. Grabow specifically said that the whole idea that trade deficits are only happening because of other countries' barriers is just plain wrong. And that it has no real economic backing. He also pointed out that you end up with these weird outcomes where you have countries with totally different economic policies, like protectionist Brazil and super open Singapore, both getting hit with the same 10% tariff. It just doesn't add up for him.
And the potential scale of the economic impact that people are talking about is pretty staggering. Larry Summers, who was Treasury Secretary a while back, Newsweek reported that he estimated this whole thing could lead to $30 trillion in losses. I mean, that's a number that definitely gets your attention, and it suggests a lot of serious concern in the economic world.
Yeah, and on the political side, Representative Susan DelBene, a Democrat from Washington state, she basically echoed those economic worries. NBC News quoted her saying these tariffs are just part of the chaos and dysfunction coming out of the Trump administration. So definitely not a fan.
And the markets themselves have been reacting pretty strongly too, which gives you a sense of how investors are feeling about all this. Al Jazeera reported that major stock indexes in the U.S. took a big hit, some of them down as much as 4%. And markets in Asia saw drops too. Even oil prices fell. So it seems like there's a lot of uncertainty and worry about the potential impact on global economic activity and demand.
And the international response has been just as fast and just as critical. Al Jazeera quoted the German chancellor calling these tariffs an attack on the global trade order. So there are definitely worries about damaging relationships with key trading partners and upsetting the whole established system of international trade.
And we've even seen some signs of pushback within the Republican Party itself. Newsweek reported that Senators Rand Paul, Mitch McConnell, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, they all got behind a resolution to end the national emergency declaration that's been in place with Canada over tariffs. Now, this isn't directly aimed at these new reciprocal tariffs, but it does suggest that at least some Republicans are uncomfortable with this kind of protectionist trade policy.
And the timeline for all of this is crazy short. Remember, these tariffs were announced on April 2nd, and according to Newsweek, they're set to go into effect just a week later on April 9th, unless President Trump steps in and changes things. So that doesn't give businesses and economies much time to prepare.
No, not at all. It puts a ton of immediate pressure on businesses to figure out their supply chains, their pricing strategies, their whole competitive landscape. They've got to deal with potential cost increases and try to predict how their international partners are going to react.
Oh.
And this super tight timeline doesn't leave much room for thorough economic analysis or for any kind of diplomatic back and forth.
Okay, so let's try to put this all together. What are the big takeaways here? What do people need to understand about these new reciprocal tariffs?
So basically, President Trump has announced these huge tariffs on goods coming from almost every country. And they're using this formula that's tied to the U.S. goods trade surplus with each nation. The administration says this is absolutely necessary to deal with what they see as unfair trade practices and to help American industry get back on its feet. Vice President Vance, calling this Liberation Day, really sums up their side of the story.
But there's a lot of pushback on this. Economists are sounding the alarm about price hikes for consumers and about the potential for serious damage to the global economy. They're saying this is like protectionism from the past coming back to haunt us. And they're even questioning the logic behind how these tariffs were calculated.
And you can see these two totally different viewpoints playing out in the reactions we've seen so far. You've got some people who are strongly in favor. They believe this is finally going to be a win for American workers. But then you've got others who are deeply concerned about the potential economic fallout and about damaging relationships with other countries. And the market reactions definitely show a lot of uncertainty and worry.
So here's something to think about as we wrap this up. Global trade is a ridiculously complex system. It's not just about tariffs. There are so many moving parts, so many things connected to each other. What are the unintended consequences that might come out of this big and sudden policy change, both for the U.S. and for the rest of the world? What does all this tell us about how globalization is changing? And what about the future of international economic relations? It's a situation that's going to keep developing, and it's one that we all need to pay attention to.
I completely agree. This is just the beginning of the story.
Oh,